In this lecture we'll talk about loops. First we'll do while loops, then we'll do while loops, then we'll do some for loops, then nested loops, and then finally we'll finish up with some variable sized tables. Okay, the first loop structure that we'll learn about is called the while loop, and you should remember this from your 101 class. We'll create a section for while loops first. Let me just load this PHP page in my browser. If you notice, I've downloaded the template for a strict XHTML document, and I've just changed the title to loops, and now I added that in there as a content. Okay, so now we have the page up. Now we can start writing some PHP code. And so the first thing with a while loop is we'll create a variable, a number, and we'll start it off at 0. And while the count is less than, say, 5, right here, we'll do this loop, and each time through the loop we'll add 1 to the count. So we'll do this loop 5 times. We'll do it for 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And all I'll do is I'll echo out the count, and then I'm going to concatenate on a line break so they'll show up on different lines inside of the web browser. And, let me see how that looks. Now we have these going right here. They're in highlighted text because I didn't make that an H3 tag. So now we see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it did the loop 5 times, but it started counting at 0 instead of 1, so that's why we get 0 through 4. And I also notice count is less than 5. So hopefully you remember these while loops from your 101 class, but just to review, this right here is a condition that we're going to check to see if we do the loop. Now, I could start the count off here at 6, and then when we do this condition, we'll see that 6 is not less than 5. So we won't do the loop at all. And as you can see, everything disappeared. But if the count starts off at, say, 3, then we'll do it for 3 and 4, and then it does the loop for 3, and then it does it for 4, and then the count is now equal to 5 when we check this condition. And 5 is not less than 5. So again, this is the condition that we check it at the beginning before we do the loop even once to make sure that this condition is met. And if this condition is met, then we'll go ahead and do whatever instructions lie inside of these brackets for the loop. And we'll add 1 to the count variable every time, and which changes the count variable. So when it comes back up here, at first it was 3, now it's 4. 4 is less than 5. We'll print it out. 4 will get incremented to 5, and then we'll find out that 5 is not less than 4. So that's when it stops, and it doesn't print out 5 because it sees that and it stops, and then it immediately jumps down to here and starts continuing its execution. So this is a while loop. Now, one new thing that we can do with PHP is we can exit out of our PHP mode, and have a little HTML block here. And now if we want to repeat a whole bunch of HTML, we can repeat it here. And set that to 0. So we might want to put in some tags there. this a span tag. Now remember that the style attributes should really go inside of the CSS style sheets, but for this demonstration we'll just put them right here. And now we see this, I will repeat this 5 times. And we can look at the page source right here, and we can see I will repeat this 5 times down here. Now, 2 other things that if you might remember from your when you learned Perl were break and continue, or next and last is what they're called in Perl. They're called break and continue in PHP. I don't know how often you'll use these, but I'll just show them to you really quick. So instead of doing this loop 5 times, we'll do it 10. I'm going to change this message here. Here's something else that we might do. This is time number and let me separate this onto different lines so that we can see it easier. So now we'll print out this is time number count for each time, and let's look over here and see what that does. 0 through 9. Again, I changed it to 10 up here. That's why it did it 10 times, 0 through 9. And it started counting at 0. Now this time, what we can do is, let's before we increment this count variable right here, what we can do is we can put in an if statement. If count is equal to 5, then we'll break. Out of the statement right here. So we'll refresh this page, and now you notice we printed out this is the 5th time right here, and then it just stopped. Now looking at the code, what happens is when the count is equal to 5, we call this break statement, and what this does is it says get out of the loop right now, and it continues on right now right here. So this is the other way you can exit a while loop, is instead of making sure you meet this condition, if you use an if statement and catch a certain condition, you can exit out of the while loop immediately. This can be helpful if you're searching through a list of items, and once you found the item, you don't need to keep searching through the rest of the list of the items. You could just quit your loop right away. So break will exit you out of the loop whenever you call it. If we didn't have an if statement around this, and we just had a break statement, then notice we go into the loop the first time and then we call break, and now we just quit the loop. So usually you'll call it within an if statement, because you don't want to quit the loop automatically every time. So that's break, and now I'll show you continue. Let's assume that we want to do this for 0 through 9, but we want to skip, say, the 5th one. So if our count is equal to 5, what we really want to do is skip this loop. Now notice I'm doing this within the PHP section and not the HTML section of the code. So if our count is equal to 5 and I want to skip this section, then I can call continue. And what continue does is it jumps us to the end of the loop, and we start over up here again. So for the 5th time, we're going to jump out of the loop. We're not going to execute all of this for the 5th time. We're going to jump out of the loop, and then we'll land outside of this loop. So we'll see what happens. Now if you notice, the page isn't coming up right away, and this might be a hint it's still loading. this is a hint that I might be in an infinite loop if it's taking a really long time. Maybe something happened to the server, but when we get into an infinite loop, eventually what will happen is the server will figure out that the PHP program isn't going to quit, and it will come back with a response. We'll see that response in a little bit, but while we're waiting for it, let's go ahead and look in this code and figure out why we got in an infinite loop. So we see that when count is equal to 5, we jump to the end of the loop and jump over again. Well, the problem is we jumped over this increment sign right here, so we never added anything to count. So we'll start this loop over again, and then count will equal 5 again. And so then we'll jump over it and come back up here, count still equals to 5, and we keep jumping over all of this stuff right here to the end of the loop and then starting the loop over again. And that's an infinite loop. So what we really want to do is also add 1 to count, and then we can continue. That way the next time we'll jump to the end of this loop, and then count will be 6, and then we'll skip this if statement and we'll actually continue on with our loop the normal way. Now if you look back up here, here's what happened. Maximum execution time of 30 seconds exceeded. So that's telling us that the script took more than 30 seconds to complete, so the server just killed my program and printed out this fatal error. But if you notice, it did print out the first times through the loop, 0 through 4, and then 5 we just kept in that infinite loop. But now I fixed it, so now if I make sure the page is saved, and then if I refresh this, now we get 0 through 4, 5 is skipped, and then 6, 7, 8, and 9. And we skip 5 with the continue statement. It tells us to jump over this stuff to the end of the loop, and we start back up at the top and keep going through. Now there is a variation on this while loop. If you notice, when I set this variable to something higher and this initial condition isn't going to pass, then it doesn't do the while loop at all. So when we refresh this, we can see that the while loop is completely gone. And sometimes we actually might want the loop to run at least once. Even if the condition isn't met at the beginning, we might say run the loop once. And so this is a little bit different philosophy. What we do is we put the while part down at the bottom and the do part at the top. So now we do this loop, and then this part at the bottom says, should I continue? Should I do it again? If this condition passes, if this resolves to true, then we'll jump back up here and we'll do this loop again. So in this case, we do the loop once for 12. We increment it to 13, and then the condition doesn't pass. Now, if we were to start this at 0, again, then of course it will keep going, and then it will add the count will be 9. We add it to make 10, and that tells us to stop. So this is a do while loop that you might want to do. And I'll turn this back into the while loop that used to be, and we get that. Okay, now the next loop that I'm going to show you will be the for loop. And once you've learned the while loop, you really don't ever have to learn another loop if you're just going to code all by yourself. Because the while loop can do anything that you want it to do. A for loop is a loop that will help you in special cases, and the idea is to make when the loop starts and finishes a lot more clear. So if we look at this while loop, we have this initialization variable up here, so that's where it's going to start. We start adding it here, but we also have to add it here, and here's our ending condition. So all of these things are separated throughout this while loop. Well, so they decided to come up with a for loop that puts all of these things in the same spot. So we can go for, and when if you're just using a simple loop counter and it doesn't really mean something other than this is how many times I'm going to the loop, usually just use a one letter variable like I or N or something like that. But we'll set I equal to 0, I less than 10, I plus plus. Okay, with this for loop right here, notice we have the starting condition, the ending condition, and also how much we're going to increment I each time. So this translates to this while loop above. If we just imagine that, got to make sure we put our dollar signs here too, but if we just imagine that this part is this right here, this part right here is this thing, the condition to check to see if we're going to continue, and then we have this part right here, and we can still break out into our break out of our HTML mode and go back into our PHP mode. We don't have to do this, but we can if we want. And now we have an HTML block that we can use, and now we can do the same thing. I'll just say this. Okay. Let's see here. Now, it's important to note that we can still use this loop counter within the inside of our loop if we want to print it out. We don't have to use it, but we can. We still have access to this variable right here. And this loop does the exact same thing as this while loop did, at least at the beginning. It starts at 0 and it goes to 9. So, when we load this up, now we get the for loop here, and we get this is loop iteration number, and we get each one of those. Now again, it's going to check this condition at the beginning, so if we initialize I to be something greater than 10 or greater, then this condition fails right away, and that means that we won't go through the loop at all. Now some of you might kind of wonder about that, why that might be useful, but sometimes you do some math and then you actually realize that you don't want to do the loop at all. Like maybe you go for I equals 0 to the number of items you have found in the database. So maybe you didn't find anything in the database, so you're not going to print anything out. So that won't do. If we look at that, the loop won't happen at all either. So this is useful right there. And so now we have this for loop. It does the same thing as the while loop up above. You can use break and continue inside of this for loop. I won't do it for this demonstration. Okay. For nested loops is basically putting a loop inside of another loop. One thing that I'll do here is do a for loop. X is less than 10. Right here. And so now we have X, and then inside of this loop, I'm going to put another for loop. So $, Y, 0, and so now I have X and Y in here, and notice this Y loop is inside of the X loop. So I'm just going to echo out right here. a string. I'm going to put my variables directly in the string x and y right here. And then if we run this, now we get over here 0, 0, 0, 1, all the way up to 0, 9, and then 1, 0. And if we notice, this keeps going and going and going forever. It's a little hard to read, so let's format this a little bit better. Maybe we can put a line break right here. And now we get more of this kind of table-like looking structure right here. And if you notice, we'll go and view the source of this. If we notice, when you see this, we see one row and then a line break, and then another row and a line break. And notice the values of x in this row always 0, and now the values of x are always 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5. So what happens here is x gets set to 0, and then we run this for loop for every value of y. So y starts at 0 and goes all the way up to 9. And then and we do that printing it out. When we're done doing when y is done, this loop quits, and then we print out a new line, and we go back and we increment x by 1, and now x is 1. And then we start y all over again for that. It starts all over again with 0 and goes up to 9, which is why we get these rows right here. Now this is all really crowded together. One thing that we can do with these for loops is we can try to turn them into nice tables. So we'll do our table tag, and then each one of these go ahead and exit out of PHP mode. Table row beginning right there, a table row end right here. Enter in my PHP mode again for the second for loop. Exit out of it. Enter it. And there we go. And now I'll fix this a little bit. So now in my HTML I print out this, and then I echo out x concatenated with a comma, concatenated with y. So now this does the inner part, and for each one of these I want a table cell, and over here another table cell. So when we look at that, let's see. Probably need to enter into my PHP mode again here. Now notice I still try to line these brackets up, even though we're going in and out of PHP mode. It could kind of be hard, but I still try to line the brackets up so I could somewhat see the indentation. And that helped me solve the problem there. And now this looks a little more spaced out. And let me view the page source. Right there. We go down, and now we could see that we got all these table rows and columns. So what we did is we made a nice looking table. And again, we should probably style this with the style sheets, but maybe we could go border is maybe 3 pixels long. Now we can maybe put a border on the table. Should probably use the style sheets to style this table up to make it look the way we want it to. But there we go, we have a table. It's done with a nested for loop. This is a for loop within a for loop. Okay, so far all of these loops, we could kind of tell right at the beginning how many times they're going to loop through and do certain stuff. And one thing that we might want to do is maybe we want to control the size of our table. Maybe we want to make it as big as, say, we'll pull something out of the database and we have certain rows, and maybe we want to make it that big. Or maybe there's some other condition that we want to have the size of these loops, the number of times that we go through this loop, go through. And by the way, usually you want to use for loops whenever you can because they're a little bit easier to read. The only time you want to really use a while loop is if at the beginning of this while loop the program doesn't know how many times this thing is going to run through. Now I'll show more examples of this, but the program right now, I mean, knows that we're going to start at 0 and we're going to finish at 10. So if at the beginning of this loop, if the program's going to know when where we're going to start at and when we're going to finish, we should probably use a for loop. So the better way to implement this would be with this for loop right here. And in this case, even though this is going to be a variable sized loop right here, and we'll I'm just going to put some instructions in here, and I'll say put arc rows equals number to print num rows here. That's some instructions right here. So now we'll get a variable called rows. Let me save that in a variable here. So the number is equal to the rows, and now we'll do a for loop I equals to 0, I is less than. Instead of a set number, I'm just going to put a number right here. Now some of you might think that I was referring to this situation right here when you would use a while loop. Well, I don't know how many times this is going to go through. I mean, it depends on what they put in this query string variable. But notice I said not if you don't know how many times it's going to go through. If the program doesn't know. Well, right now it knows the ending value and the beginning value. Once it gets it from the query string, we know the ending value. So we'd still use a for loop in this situation. Now where we might not know, and we'll run into this in the future, is when we pull something out of the database, it will return a certain number of rows in the table. And we might not know how many rows are that it returned, but we can just ask for the next row, and we could keep on asking for the next row until there are no rows left. So that would be a while loop, because we'd say, give me the next row, and it said, nope, there isn't a next row, and then the while loop would quit. But it will keep going as long as there is another row. And so that the program doesn't necessarily know how many rows there are, how many rows it's got. It just knows that it can keep asking for the next row. And right here, we'll just echo out I, and it'll concatenate on a new line so that they're on different lines. And let me refresh this. And so now down here we just have the instructions. I'm gonna put a line break here too. And now we can bring in rows equals 5. And now we go 0 through 4. And rows equal to 10. and we scroll down and we get 0 through 10. So we could bring in a variable too, and for this nested loop, I won't do this, I'll leave this as an exercise to you, but we can bring in a variable right here and we could control how many rows we have. And we could bring in another variable and control how many columns we have. And that wraps up our lecture on loops. Hopefully you remember most of this from your 101 lecture. It's done almost in the exact same way as you did it in Perl or Java or any other language that you might have come from.